ever tried, is the live stream working?
It's about to go on, but
Okay, cool. I was going to say, have you ever, or ask you, have you ever tried live streaming directly from Facebook? Because I know it must be different.
about to go on, but
Okay, cool. I was going to say, have you ever, or ask you, have you ever tried live streaming directly from?
hello?
I'm here. The audio just lagged really badly for a second there.
Well, okay, but we are on live, and we are now recording to the cloud. Aviale, it's great to see you. This is the Ides of May, 2 months after the Ides of March. Am I reading the Roman calendar correctly, or you can tell me if I'm wrong?
I believe so. You're on point there. It's an interesting day to do a live stream, so seems appropriate.
It's an interesting day. What?
I said it's an interesting day to do a live stream, so I think that it's appropriate.
Okay, tell me what's interesting about it. Other than you're always interesting, but what makes the day interesting?
It's just interesting because it seems like every time we do a video, in particular, it generally falls on a holiday or some kind of day of historical significance. It literally every time we do a video, it seems that way. And I suppose this is no exception, but is there a particular reason you wanted to do the video today, or was that just kind of coincidental?
Well, I mean, we had that little discussion this morning, and you were telling me about your anger about, let's see, what are the title I chose? Treachery and Cowardice on the right, and I guess I'm dealing with some personal issues relating to treachery and cowardice today, and since it's exactly 2 months after the Ides of March, it seemed appropriate.
I agree.
I mean, what I'm seeing is that people are scared. People are so scared right now. They are scared to think. They are scared of their own shadow. My son is, an attorney in the District of Columbia, PricewaterhouseCoopers, just spent almost 2 weeks with him, 10 days up in Washington, and he was scared for anyone to be seen with me anywhere. He was scared to introduce me to anyone at his work. He was scared. He was just scared. I mean, I'm not that notorious a murderer, I'm a very low-level murderer. I kill cockroaches in New Orleans all the time. It's pretty much it. And I realize some people think they have the same right as we do, but that's why they let all the immigrants in. But anyhow, it's just very strange. I am acutely aware today of what you were talking about, and you've talked about this before about Yang, because some of my California friends have become part of the Yang gang, and I'm just horrified. I am absolutely horrified and mortified. And I mean, as far as David Duke supporting, what's her name, the Muslim woman, I mean, that is probably partly sarcasm, and it is just because, everybody, Protestants hate the Catholics, and the Catholics hate the Protestants, and Hindus hate the Muslims, and everybody hates the Jews. But during National Brotherhood Week, old Tom Lehrer song, way predates you. But if you've never heard Tom Lehrer, you should listen to him. Anyhow, that's why. But I mean, I want to hear from you about what you see going on right now.
Well, to be quite honest, I think we're entering into a very interesting period of time that is very polarizing for everyone that's involved in the current political climate. A lot of people that originally had a lot of enthusiasm, especially around 2017, around the period of time from Trump's election and shortly thereafter, a lot of people were fueled by this nationalist enthusiasm and the spirit of unity that you could feel between different ideological branches of the right wing. That was a very empowering thing to experience. And of course, that culminated in the Unite the Right event, which is essentially the first event that really put me on the political map, because I was there to document all of the tyrannical subversions and the acts of violence committed by the left and all those things that really illustrated to the entire country exactly how manipulative, subversive, and downright sinister the threat that we are facing is. But not only that, it also showed how the government is often complicit in these acts of terrorism and either facilitate them, as they did in Charlottesville and as they did at the Stone Mountain event earlier this year, or simply stand idly by and do nothing to intervene when leftist domestic terrorists decide to rain havoc and acts of violence against those on the right wing. It demonstrated to the entire country just how much of a problem this is becoming in terms of the political discourse in modern America. Now, my frustration comes into play in observing the behaviors of people that adhere to what they refer to as the alt-right philosophy for a few different reasons, but the primary one is that I feel that the alt-right had potential in addressing what they refer to as alternative issues that are not addressed by the mainstream media, particularly in regards to identitarianism, to European identity, to European politics, to racial awareness, to all of these things that we absolutely need to discuss. They were bringing to the forefront these issues that are largely neglected by the mainstream media or discussed in a way that is entirely antagonistic towards our respective interests. And so for that reason, I felt that it's so valuable, it possesses so much potential. But then I've seen it absolutely disintegrate within the last 2 years in the most humiliating fashion possible, to the extent now where the leaders of the alt-right are openly endorsing individuals like this Asian socialist Yang, who they have thoroughly sold out all of their political convictions for, in the name of a false security of governmental financial assistance and $1,000 a month. Despite the fact that he also endorses naturalizing over 11 million illegals into this country, who of course would also fall under the jurisdiction of that universal basic income, which would collectively amount to over $2.7 trillion in annual federal expenditure to compensate for that universal basic income, in addition to everything else he's wanting to instigate, which includes further gun regulations, including fining gun manufacturers $1 million per casualty when one of their respective firearms is involved. He wants to further regulate free speech. He wants to stomp out racism, anti-Semitism, and hatred and bigotry, which he has made thoroughly and abundantly clear in his tweets. Just all of these things illustrates how subversive these policies are, and yet many people continue to enthusiastically support Yang. Now, the interesting thing about it is that part of them claim that it's an act of satire. They approach it from a position of cynicism. In a sense, they just want to express their frustration with Trump. And I've noticed that when you actually inquire about the legitimate policies that Yang supports, they often retreat back into this argument, whether they either say, well, it's just a meme and you're taking it too seriously, or they say, well, what has Trump done? So they always deflect from the point back into their frustrations with Trump either way. And if they can't form any rational argument to defend the economic and social policies that Yang has, they simply say, oh, it's just a meme and you don't get it, which is not the case, because they're openly, seriously discussing the legitimacy of his policies, including vehemently supporting this idea that they simply want $1,000 a month from the government. And I don't consider that to be in any way, shape, or form beneficial to white identity, because it's just as applicable to every other racial demographic in the United States. So this isn't something that's particularly beneficial to white identity, and it's, in my opinion, a cop-out and an expression of their nihilism and their frustration with the current political system. But when it comes down to it, they don't actually possess any tangible solutions or answers. So that is just one of the many points that I definitely am experiencing a type of frustration with. But that's definitely a primary one, in seeing people that claim to support white identity sell out so readily just for a promise of $1,000 a month. That is very disheartening to me.
I don't know what you can do with $1,000 a month. It doesn't get very far, honestly. But you know, the point is they're selling themselves very cheap. It is kind of interesting. I know that Switzerland, like, what was it, 4 or 5 years ago, had a nationwide referendum on basic minimum income and voted it down. And you know, I don't think any country has it, do they? I mean, does basic minimum income exist anywhere in the world today?
They often quote certain European countries that have implemented similar policies, although most of them usually go back to countries that have implemented universal health care and that sort of thing, which again is in itself arguable because it's usually from countries that are generally ethnically homogenous, have a population of less than 1 million people or just several 100,000 individuals in their country, and have closed borders. So it's an entirely different situation than the social and economic situation in the United States. So it's always a false equivalence anyway. But there's not exactly a whole lot of successful examples, in my opinion.
Hendrik over on Red Ice had an interesting video last night. I don't know if you saw it, about the sexual revolution in Sweden and how Sweden's relative prosperity, I guess, in the 50s and 60s, owing to the fact that it was one of the few countries that managed to stay completely neutral in World War II. They were unburdened by Reconstruction, unburdened by war devastation. And so they were doing fine, and they became sort of a raving example of socialism. And that led first to the Swedish cinema role. This is very interesting. I highly recommend it. Not everything that is online these days is quite that good, but first it led to Swedes being held up as icons of pro-socialist socialist reform in the United States, like Gunnar Myrdal. It sounds almost racist, the title of his book, but he talked about the Negro problem in America. And anyhow, and then they led the world in the sexual revolution of the 1960s and 70s, and now they are obliterated, close to a point of obliteration by immigration from basically Islamic Muslims who never could have gotten there without invitation.
Right.
And I mean, it's fascinating to watch. I think. What do you think it is, though? I mean, do you think it's just the backlash from Charlottesville? I mean, it's not just the political system, of course. It's also the legal system, isn't it?
It is, absolutely.
I mean, because I know that you've written extensively about, the trial of the fellow accused of killing Heather Heyer. I can't even remember his name.
James Field.
James Field. Has anything happened with that in the past few months?
I know that last time I was reading about it was essentially that obviously his life is ruined. He'll spend the remainder of it in prison, and it's a very atrocious situation, because when placed into situations like that, even in terms of legality, when you're supposed to be properly represented, you aren't. And the fact that the individual who is a member of Antifa that actually has an occupation as a professor at a university testified and admitted to chasing James Fields down the street with a rifle immediately prior to his entering his vehicle, and everything else happening immediately after that. Despite this member of Antifa openly testifying in court and admitting to the fact that he chased James Fields down the street with a rifle in an act of terrorism, this was ignored.
What's the person who admitted that?
His last name is Dixon. I can't remember his first name right now, but anyway, he's a member of that section of Antifa that's known as Redneck Revolt. Essentially, they're the armed militia, quote unquote, of Antifa. I can't remember exactly what his name. If it was Daryl Dixon, something like that.
In other words, he's a white person.
Yes.
He's a white man.
Yes. And he openly testified in court to committing that atrocity, to committing essentially an act of terrorism, because that's the definition of terrorism, is to use physical intimidation and violence for the perpetuation of political purposes. And that's precisely what he did prior to everything happening that happened with James Fields, to that unfortunate casualty, to everything else that happened. You know, when placed into context, one realizes that what was told by the mainstream media is, of course, entirely and grossly inaccurate. But was James Fields properly represented in court? Of course not. He was forced to plead guilty to avoid the death penalty. There is no justice. There is no sense of neutrality or logical discussion when it comes to these things. Why? Because they're so heavily sensationalized by the media that you've already lost the case before you even enter the courtroom. There is no contest in regards to that. And it's very interesting because I remember making the point when I saw that Bernie Sanders, who is notoriously a Democratic, quote unquote, Democratic socialist, was openly calling for felons, particularly the Boston bomber, to have the right to vote. And I raised a point over this, and I said, if you believe that the Boston bomber who committed an atrocious act of terrorism still yet possesses the right to political influence, then I demand that James Fields likewise gets a vote. But of course, they're not going to concede to that. They're not going to allow that, because it's only about perpetuating their own agenda, which they will perpetuate through terrorism and through Antifa and through Black Lives Matter and all of these other organizations of leftist terrorism if necessary. So none of this should be a surprise, but it's very self-evident that they are corrupt in every way, shape, or form.
You have said several interesting, well, you said a million interesting things, but one of them was you were talking about the people on the right. You said this on the telephone this morning, that the alt-rightists, they post Hitler memes, and they relate everything to the Jews, and this is their focus, and yet they're supporting, as I think the Andrew Yang business shows, they're really supporting the institutionalization of diversity of a racially heterogeneous population, which is, I think, to me, the most disturbing aspect of everything. And so, I mean, I just wondered if you can elaborate on that. I mean, you also posted something the other day about a homogeneous population being a key to, I can't even remember what it was that you were talking about, but you were talking about how certain legal programs, certain legal positions can only exist in a homogeneous society.
Absolutely.
And do you feel that, and that basically the alt-right has completely abandoned that position?
I do, because I've had numerous conversations with members of the alt-right about this topic. In particular, I've had some actually tell me they prefer communism over our current system because our current system is essentially ruled by the Jews. The logical fallacy of that, I think, is rather self-evident. To simply state that one so nonchalantly accepts communism and does not perceive communism as the existential threat that it is. That in itself is absolutely barbaric, that we would ever consider a political ideology that is responsible for the deaths of over 100 million people, including the mass starvation of one's own citizens in one's own country, which is in itself antithetical to their idea of blood and soil. You know, this is a problem. It's a problem that we have developed an acceptance of communism. I never thought that I would see the day when identitarians accept that. And that to me was one of the most atrocious things I've ever witnessed, to be quite honest. I think that it's
two questions.
the alt-right has reached, go ahead.
Two questions about that. Sure. Isn't communism basically widely, historically recognized to be a Jewish creation?
Yes, it is actually, which is in itself a point of irony that they justify it by arguing that the other side is infiltrated by Judaic influence.
And the other thing is, I guess, how does one distinguish between communism and socialism? Because if people post Hitler memes and want to adopt communism, Was there ever such a thing as national communism? Because Hitler's party was called National Socialist.
Well, I think that the true answer to that question lies in look at Poland during World War II. Look at what they experienced in terms of being ravaged by both Soviet Russia and by Nazi Germany. Look at the interesting historical events that unfolded there. But the interesting thing is, I myself, in the discussions of communism and socialism, do differentiate solely according to the basis of the nationalistic element involved in one and its, lack in the other. However, there is an immense irony to it because we've spent effectively 2 years arguing that National Socialism and communism are entirely antithetical to one another. That has been the argument since the very beginning of the formation of the alt-right, especially after Charlottesville, because everyone began to call us Nazis and so on and so forth, while communism is obviously paraded about as the morally superior ideology on the left. And so we've spent so much time elaborating and arguing upon the differences of communism and National Socialism. But we've reached a point now where those who claim to be National Socialists are now espousing communism. That's not an exaggeration because Matthew Heimbach explicitly quoted the Communist Manifesto, and then Andrew Anglin just published an article 2 days ago about why we need to use communism to destroy current society. So this
How does that work? I mean, I haven't seen the article, but I mean, just wildly imagining, we are, in my mind, we're almost a communist society right now.
Precisely. And his idea is to essentially perpetuate that idea. He actually explicitly says in the article, he says, I'm not referring to adopting a nationalistic type of ideology. I'm talking about accepting it just as it is. And this will help perpetuate our goal to destroy our enemies because those on the left will be the first to die in a quote unquote communist revolution. This is a very baffling point to argue. I never thought I'd see the day when people that claim to adhere to a right-wing ideology would openly espouse communism. That to me is very indicative that we've reached a point of nihilism and of desperation and cynicism that I really never thought we would reach. I never thought we would arrive at this point where it's necessary to say, hey, communism is not a right-wing ideology. That's pretty terrifying, to be quite honest, that people have reached that low of an ideological and existential purpose where they don't see a point in anything. Their only goal at this time and the only unification that they base any efforts on is to effectively destroy society through accelerationism, which is an ideology that I vehemently disagree with. I don't
know that word, accelerationism.
Yes, accelerationism. Essentially the idea that we can utilize social change to serve as a catalyst for drastic change in society or in the world. So basically the idea behind accelerationism in terms of Yang is to support him so that his policies create a catalyst effect and speed up the rate by which the country disintegrates and falls apart so that we can instigate a civil war, basically destroy the country and rebuild it in the image of the alt-right. That's the idea, because they don't believe that anything at this point is salvageable, and so it's necessary to destroy everything that remains of modern society and rebuild it. Richard Spencer has actually openly said that his ideas are post-American because they understand that their ideas in themselves are antithetical to American philosophy. So you reach a point where you have to ask, do I support American philosophy and the ideals of liberty and individual autonomy, of personal education and integrity, and states' autonomy and the restrictions of the federal government? Do I advocate these ideas and the American philosophy, or do I advocate a philosophy that is entirely antithetical to the American ideal, which is precisely what all of this is, because none of this is compatible with American philosophy, and they know that, which is why they openly admit, we want an ethno-state. We want something that we cannot have in current society. So the only solution is to destroy what currently exists and build something to replace it. So, I disagree with that for numerous reasons, I think most of which are self-evident.
Where do you stand on the question of an ethno-state?
Oh boy, this is a big question. So first and foremost, we know that every nation in the beginning of its formation, in order to maintain security and success and stability in a nation, obviously those nations are going to be ethnically homogenous. We're not exactly in a state in modern America where we can exactly deport every person that isn't European. We're not quite at that point. That's not exactly a feasible solution. To post memes about it and suggest that it is a feasible solution is just a rather satirical and nihilistic point of distraction, because that's not in any way, shape, or form feasible. Obviously, I'm one of those people that believes that every demographic has the right to seek their own preservation and self-interest. Any reasonable person should find that to be an agreeable point. How does every demographic pursue their own respective interests? By having their own respective countries. It is within the realm of logic and reason to suggest that, we need to have ethnically homogenous societies, because that is how we preserve our own ideals and our own cultural wealth as well, how we preserve that and maintain that against time. Both the Chinese and the Japanese have been remarkable in the preservation of their particular and respective cultures and ideas. Why? Because Japan is 98% ethnic Japanese. That is how they maintain their culture, and it's been truly incredible to see how their own societies have essentially stood the test of time, and how they have preserved in such a pristine condition their own ideas. It's really remarkable to see that. And again, that is, of course, correlated to the fact that they maintain a primarily ethnically homogenous society. So, that in itself is not an inherently bad idea. There's nothing evil about saying that whites have the right to have their own explicitly European countries, just as Africans have theirs, just as Asians have theirs, and so on and so forth. There's nothing inherently malevolent about that notion. And the left doesn't necessarily believe so either, because they certainly never speak a word of it when it comes to Japan being primarily ethnically Japanese, or China having its respective immigration policies, or Russia having its, or whatever, so on and so forth. Every other country in the world practically has these, of course, except for Europe, given its modern state. But if any other demographic in the world institutes these ideas regarding the restriction of immigration in order to preserve their own culture and heritage, there's absolutely nothing wrong with it. And the left never speaks a word of complaint about it. It's only in terms of European civilization and identity that it becomes a problem. So that's the whole issue at this point. But American civilization is not in a predicament where we can exactly deport everyone who is not white.
Not civilization, you mean politically?
We're not there.
You mean politically we can't do it?
No, it's not realistic to do
civilization, that. I mean, the culture and technology certainly exist to do that if we wanted to. We are after all, the most imprisoning nation in the world. We know how to round people up and put them in cages.
Arguably so, yes, but it's definitely not something that I consider to be an answer or to be feasible. And despite all of the insistence to the contrary by people on the alt-right that insist that that's what we should do, I'm sorry, that's not going to happen, and it's not feasible, it's not realistic. We're not at that point. And of course, that's precisely why they want to simply destroy all of American civilization and essentially create an ethnic state in its place, and so on and so forth, and all of those wonderful utopian ideals that they have. So, we're not there. That's not the reality of the situation, and I'm not exactly in favor of serving as a catalyst for the destruction of society. So I find that to be an unrealistic goal to perceive.
You were asking about the motivations for having a talk today in particular, and I think I told you that part of the reason is because for the past several days, since Rick Tyler announced that he was going to run for president on the American Freedom Party ticket, I had assumed that you were already on the board, and I had said that you should be listed as part of the board, and I've now nominated you to be a member of the board, because the board consists of, look at me. I'm guessing that if you look at me, 21 fresh face that you are, one of the first words that does not occur to you is young, and yet I am in fact the youngest member of the board of the American Freedom Party, and that's just a disaster, and it sort of shows what a complete farce that aspect of the third position. I don't know if you consider the third position to be alt-right or not. I don't. We'll have to define a little bit more of what the what third alt-right and third position means. But the original name of the American Freedom Party was American Third Position, and we need we need young people to be a part of this party if it's going to have any meaning at all. And where do we get the impetus to bring young people in when there are no ideas? When there is no, I mean, if young people basically are fleeing from the kind of pressure that my son feels in Washington, fear of being associated with bad old dad. What do we do with that? I mean, how do we define ourselves in a way? If you say you don't believe in the ethno state. Bill Johnson is the founder and chairman of the American Freedom Party. His big goal is the ethno state. If you don't want an ethno state and you don't want to advocate deportation of 20 to 30% of the current population, I don't know exactly where we stand. It does sound rather daunting. What's your way, Aviela? What's your way? How do you want to restore it? If we don't ethnically cleanse and we don't split up, what do we do?
Okay, so first of all, to elaborate upon the situation regarding the ethno state, it's not that I'm opposed to the idea of an ethno state, it's that I don't see it as being currently feasible in the United States, because let's be honest, like I said, we're not going to deport by force people that have always lived in the United States that are of a different.
But that's not actually what people like Bill Johnson and Rick Tyler are proposing. I don't think they're not proposing mass deportation at all. They're proposing basically secession, splitting up.
Well, see, I'm not at all opposed to that idea. That was actually my next point that I was going to make, is that I think that taking into consideration, the aspect of political ideology that we discuss regarding Southern nationalism, I do believe that is much more feasible, than the idea of mass deportation and that sort of thing. Obviously, regarding the deportation of illegals, that's not even a question. That's self-evident. Obviously, that's 100% supported. It's only the question of whether we're talking about the idea of literally deporting everyone that's not European. That's obviously not realistic. But the idea of secession is more realistic. That's something that we might discuss and talk about. Why? Because when we look in the historical context in the Civil War, the entire idea was the ideological opposition between a globalist and governmental centralization of power and, an overbearing federal government that essentially supersedes the autonomy of the states, which is, of course, a macrocosm for the autonomy of the individual. And that is the primary observation of the Civil War. People attempt to make it about other sensationalized issues, namely the racial issue. I'm not sure if you read my essay that I wrote on that recently, but I actually published an essay on that discussion. But that's the primary issue regarding the Civil War, was essentially the right to preserve states' autonomy in opposition to the federal government, which is supposed to be severely limited in its capacity to interfere in the lives of the individual and of the state. So, that is something that's still an issue, because obviously states' autonomy was overruled by the power of the federal government. And here we are in a pseudo-communist society that is overruled by an overbearing federal government that's reinforcing censorship and all of these other totalitarian ideas that we don't support at all and that are completely antithetical to everything that we represent. That's where we are. Arguably, that is a direct consequence of what happened during the Civil War. So if we're looking at that in terms of historical context, that's something to discuss. I'm actually writing an essay right now on my own personal political ideology, which will be differentiated from the alt-right, of course. But it's primarily what I call a kind of combination of a sort of reactionary libertarianism meshed together with Southern nationalism, which obviously heavily prioritizes state autonomy. And part of that is what I believe will be the eventual cessation of the states. Now, the thing is, you know that in law,
The eventual what?
the secession of the states.
Okay, but I almost thought I heard you said cessation of the states. That I've been looking at this issue of potential secession for a long time, and I think one of the things that bothers me most is the states don't exist anymore, really. I mean, the way they did in 1860, they definitely do not exist. I mean, they have no genuine autonomy at all. They are all completely dependent on Washington handouts through income tax and Social Security, government spending. Basically, what legislatures do. I'm one of my good friends, my best friends in the world, as a matter of fact, is a state legislator up in Montana. And what they do when they get together is they split up federal revenue sharing. That's what the state legislatures do, is they spend federal money. And, the idea that they can enforce anything. I mean, maybe the benighted, horribly bloated state of California could somehow go it alone if they really wanted to. But it's hard to picture. And for any of the smaller states, it's almost inconceivable that they could secede at this point in history, because the interdependency is just too great. It is like in the 1930s when they instituted Social Security, Alabama, true to its states' rights traditions, complained that it was being coerced into the Social Security system, and the Supreme Court ruled, you're not being coerced. You actually have to voluntarily sign on for this. And if you don't, well, here's what, you don't have to. You just won't get any of the money everybody else will be getting. The Supreme Court says that. Justice Benjamin Cardozo won't say a word about what his ethnicity was, except it was similar to that of Felix Frankfurter. And so, what do we do? I mean, where would secession take place? I mean, Rick Tyler. We got to get together with Rick Tyler one of these days in a podcast, because one of his ideas is, just buy a few acres and declare independence. I recently attended, I don't know where it is, I don't know, I recently attended I have another poster in addition to this one of an Indian, a Native American sovereignty conference that took place at Tulane sometime in April, I guess. And one of the Indian tribes around here bought 11 acres to do traditional farming on.
I mean, it's interesting. What was that?
I'm just saying that sovereignty. That's the new nation, the seed of a new nation.
Well, it's very interesting because that's actually been a topic of conversation in many different circles in the right wing. I've heard people talk about that, about adopting this essentially agrarian lifestyle, one that essentially takes away the dependency of the right wing away from the majority of this industrialized society. So it is, in a sense, kind of a resurgence of a Confederate spirit in the sense of the restoration of individual responsibility for oneself and one's family. And, that does thoroughly deprive their contingency from the federal government. It does kind of create this sense of independence that I think is necessary. But the thing about this is that this is something that requires decades to really culminate those resources, I think, in order to make, a very formidable dent in terms of our relation with the federal government, because there are, so many people, and in comparison to those that hold different political beliefs, we're a rather small minority right now. But, it is very interesting because that is one of the kind of preparatory steps that a lot of people have emphasized. And I also think it's very important coming from a family that obviously has always depended on that self-sufficiency. Going back to the times of, my great-grandparents and during the Great Depression and all of that, and having a family that was so developed in terms of that own self-sufficiency, I think is part of what truly shaped my own political perception of things, because I find it to be very distasteful to be entirely reliant upon the federal government. And that's why I thoroughly, reject this idea that we need to develop a further developed contingency on the federal government in the forms of governmental assistance and all those things. But this is something that will require so much time to really develop. The idea that, we need to take these steps in order to make secession a practical, tangible possibility. It's definitely a rather daunting task, but there's really no solution at this point that isn't, when it comes to exactly what we're dealing with.
Well, I mean, I just wonder, when you talk about secession, who would secede now? I mean, so you're saying that, are you saying that you believe it's possible for an ethno state to secede now, or it's not? I mean, what are you saying? Tell me what your bottom line is here.
Here's the interesting thing. I think that it is possible in key, quote unquote, battleground states, in states where we are seeing a formidable resistance of that sort of thing. Now, the interesting thing is, that in law, there are two different forms of segregation, quote unquote. There is like the de facto segregation and the de jure segregation, the spontaneous segregation and the legally reinforced segregation. The fact is, racial demographics segregate naturally. That's something that I noticed even up north. I lived in a predominantly white area right outside of Chicago, and Chicago is obviously, it has an incredibly high percentage of minority demographics in Chicago. It's one of the most talked about places for that reason. But in the area where I lived, it was primarily segregated. That was a spontaneous development. And, if you say that, you're considered to be a racist, but that's just the fact of the matter. It can be observed in any larger situation, but also in localized situations. I noticed that in high school, that demographics typically segregated themselves according to their own respective interests. No one forced them to sit at a different lunch table. No one forced them to be among their own. No one forced me to hang out with, it's a natural, spontaneous development. It's going to happen eventually. And I think that
raises an interesting issue, though. I mean, it seems like they're trying to suppress even that and to penalize that when it happens. I mean, I have to interject. I mean, one of the things we're all that's gone back since we first talked is, whether Christianity is an appropriate vehicle for white people anymore. And I say it has been for 2,000 years and should continue to be. But I have to admit, as in regards to all institutional churches, that argument is getting awfully weak these days, because my church here in New Orleans, Trinity, 1329 Jackson Avenue, founded by Bishop and future Confederate General Leonidas Polk, died in defense of Atlanta, and they are basically forcing blacks to join the congregation, and they're forcing white people to, enthusiastically welcome them. I mean, it's so not working, and it's fascinating to watch it not work. Tonight, for example, I'm skipping. I can't imagine why I'm skipping. I'm skipping a Ramadan dinner at Trinity Episcopal Church in New Orleans. I'm skipping. I mean, watch me. I mean, this. I love this church, and I'm skipping a major dinner that they're having for Ramadan.
That is absolutely atrocious, isn't it? Why don't you go ahead and give them a hammer and nails and let them crucify you in the name of political correctness, for God's sake? I think that's where we are.
I think there are members of the clergy considering it. Actually, they found the rector, whom I have been very fond of. He he unfriended me because I copied this podcast, several editions of this podcast, on his timeline, and he said, "I can't have anybody looking at that. They'll think that I'm more of you."
Well, that's not very tolerant now, is it? That's not very, very adherent.
Well, I mean, I asked him, "Do you want me to stop coming to this church?" And he was just so puzzled, and he said, "No, but I want you to listen to me. I mean, and I told several members of the clergy, I think of racism as love. I don't think of racism as hate. I think of racism as love. I mean, the love I feel for my family that I extend to my extended family."
Well, the thing about it is that when you consider it in the light of spontaneous segregation, and no, I'm not talking about legally reinforced segregation. I'm talking about spontaneous segregation that every single demographic participates in by their own voluntary will. It's a form of mutual respect when you really stop and, consider it. I respect the autonomy of a demographic to have and pursue their own interests. I want that to be reciprocated.
What I always used to quote was, "Good fences make good neighbors."
They do, absolutely. And that is absolutely applicable in this case as well, because the fact is, you cannot force people to integrate together in the name of political correctness and expect them to like each other. It's almost as if someone in a position of political power and influence is trying to cultivate antagonism between the races. I wonder why anyone would ever want to do that.
Well, and this goes back to what we're saying about the alt-right, doesn't it? How is it working out that all these things keep coming back to the same result? No matter how something starts, it's as if the homogenizing forces of the world all keep pushing back. I mean, who would think that the alt-right, anybody in the alt-right, would be endorsing communism now?
To be completely honest with you, I never would have imagined that would happen. I never conceived of that as a possibility. Consider that an act of youthful naivety, if you like. I had great ambitions and great aspirations for them, even though I never considered myself to be an adherent to the alt-right, for several different reasons. But, I have a perception of the right wing in general that I'm willing to work with those who have a common purpose and common ambition with myself, as long as we can work together in terms of civility and competence. And that was something that I found.
Where do you draw the line? I mean, I'm interested. Where do you draw the line?
Just as what I just said, if you're capable of competence and mutual respectability, then I can work with you. But the fact is, I realize that we have goals that seem to be completely antithetical to one another. I believe in the preservation of the American ideal of constitutionality, of liberty, and all these things. That obviously necessitates an element of identitarianism and racial awareness. The two are not contrary to one another or diametrically opposed to one another, as they seem to argue. One necessitates the other. But I don't at all agree.
That was actually what you were saying the other day. The constitutional government presupposes and depends on homogeneity.
It does, absolutely. It does. I believe that. That's essentially an integral portion of what creates and cultivates a stable, coherent society, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's the thing, though, is that I just found that our approaches are so extremely different from one another. But the fact is that I don't really see any ambition in terms of the collective alt-right. I don't see any ambition to change anything. Do they really think that, going to an event every once in a while and yelling about Hitler and the Jews is going to successfully persuade anyone that you're correct about anything? No, it makes you look like a maniac that's obnoxious and doesn't really have anything constructive to say. And that's not a criticism of any particular individual. It's just a collective observation that I've made of how they act as a group. It's just, I can sit here all day and act as if I'm accomplishing something constructive when in actuality all I'm doing is just scrounging around the dark corners of the internet, posting memes of Hitler and trying to be edgy and say something intentionally inflammatory to garner attention from my group of 60 friends on the internet. That's fine, but that's not accomplishing anything constructive. You're not convincing anyone that you're correct on anything. You're not expanding your ideas. You're not applying your ideas. You're not convincing anyone you're right about anything. And anyone that dares disagree with this ideology or have the audacity to question it is essentially thrown to the wolves, and they don't get any coherent response to their argument or any refutation. They merely get a, oh, you're a cuck, you're a degenerate, you're a Jew, and they get blocked or something similar, or bombarded with these retarded memes that have no purpose. It's just, to put it bluntly, that's very juvenile.
Have I ever told you I love you?
I appreciate that. But I want to pause for a moment and say that I do feel the need to give credit where it's due. There are certain people that are considered to be within the alt-right that I do respect on an intellectual level, like Jared Taylor. Richard Spencer, I have my disagreements with, but he says certain things that I do agree with. And I give him props for being able to say things, at least in a capacity that is not, obnoxious and just, essentially trolling. I can respect what he says that is said in an intelligent and competent manner. There are people that I can respect on that basis, and I don't even have to agree with them. The primary issue that I have is that it's spiraled into this nihilistic ideological echo chamber that is not accomplishing anything. And that's the fascinating thing, is when I see people from other right-wing ideologies that are made fun of and ridiculed and basically excommunicated from the alt-right community come to me, and they want to discuss viable solutions. And they want to discuss actual, tangible alternatives to these issues that we're dealing with. It takes me back a moment. I had someone within the last week contact me, a libertarian, a voluntarist, actually, contact me, someone that of course would be ridiculed by the alt-right, someone that would be labeled a centrist or a degenerate or a cuck or whatever fancy, 4-letter word they prefer to use in this day and age to insult someone without any logical debate. Someone that would obviously never be considered intelligent in any, way, form, or fashion by the alt-right. Reach out to me and say, let's talk about coordinating and actually building bridges and actually network and discuss ideas and go to events and talk and do something productive. And, it took me back for a moment because I thought, wow, I'm talking to a libertarian, someone that is considered to be a moderate, someone that doesn't have the slightest inclination towards the alt-right, and yet they want to present more viable and tangible, practical, applicable solutions. And yet the alt-right has done nothing in that end for, my God, 2 years, essentially. What have we accomplished? Who have we convinced that we're correct? It's
the other way around. I mean, I think that, the media is closing in on us and becoming more and bolder and bolder. I mean, all these kids who get, the idea that kids can get in trouble in high school all over the country for wearing Confederate flags.
Absolutely.
That's so radically incomprehensible.
It's absolutely insane.
And
I actually just saw an article.
Almost every day there's something like that going on.
I just saw an article yesterday, and I could not believe this when I read it. If a conservative ever wrote something like this, they would face, my God, they would lose their job. They would be ostracized from every known social circle. They would have their lives effectively ruined if a conservative wrote something like this. But I read an article where a liberal was defending that school shooting that was committed at the hands of a transgender, and they claimed that the shooting was justified because it brought awareness to white supremacy and it demonstrated transgender autonomy.
What?
They said that this shooting was an act of justified violence against white supremacy.
We have liberals on the internet openly endorsing acts of terrorism, openly encouraging acts of violence. And what is our response? To sit on the internet and post memes of a frog, to post memes of Hitler, to say, let's be as inflammatory and controversial as we can and do absolutely nothing productive while we watch everything crumble around us because we have nothing better to do than stew in our complacent, cesspool of nihilism. I'm not okay with that. I'm not complacent. I'm not in a position where I'm merely willing to sit here and watch everything completely disintegrate and be destroyed when I feel the ambition and the drive and the initiative to go and do something about it. That is my primary issue with this, because these are acts of explicit terrorism being committed against anyone who has the audacity, they don't even have to be right wing, anyone that has the audacity to question the authoritarian nature of the left. I actually read an article today that was posted on Medium. It's actually being circulated quite a bit right now. And it's called something like Laughter, the new hate symbol of the far right, or something like that. And the entire article is written by this liberal who's talking about, and they literally, the liberal literally says this in the essay. She says, we have done everything to destroy them. We have gotten them fired from their jobs. We've had their bank accounts shut down. We've done everything, and yet they still laugh in our face. Why are they still happy? And they're talking about people across the right wing, of course, that have been subject to things like that. I've been subject to things like that. Several people I know have had their bank accounts shut down. This is a phenomenon that affects the entire right wing. And most recently, I don't know if you saw, there's a 14-year-old girl that is going viral right now because she posted some videos making fun of Islam, making fun of social justice warrior rhetoric, and so on and so forth. And it was it was scathing, the things that she had to say. And she's 14 years old. And the things that this girl had to say about the left were quite scathing. And this article that was discussing how the left, encourages all these attacks on the right wing, included attacking that girl. And they're like, we've contacted her parents, we've harassed her, we've harassed them, we've done everything to shut this girl down. And it's just like they demonstrate just how terroristic they are, that they even go after a child, a 14-year-old girl, to silence her because they cannot stand anyone to have the right and the ability and the capacity to say something that they don't agree with. So, it's like all of this is going on. There are explicit acts of terrorism that are happening against those who dare disagree with the left. People are having their bank accounts shut down. People are having, all of their social media accounts destroyed, banned, permanently silenced. People are being fired from their jobs and effectively are having their lives ruined. And what the hell are we doing about it? What are we doing other than just, scrounging around the dark corners of the internet, posting inflammatory memes for our own amusement and desperation out of nihilism because of the state of the modern world? We're not doing anything about it. We're not doing anything constructive. But when someone that is considered a centrist comes to me and says, let's talk about viable solutions, let's talk about creating something that can serve as an effective alternative to Facebook and Twitter and these social media sites, let's hold events in awareness of free speech, let's go to this location and talk to these people, let's go meet these activists, let's do something. And I just paused and I just stepped away from the situation for a moment, and I looked and I watched and I thought, here we have the alternative right. They have some warranted and valuable ideas, but they're not doing anything. And now on this other side, I have someone that they would readily ridicule, someone that they would despise on the basis of their slight ideological difference, that they don't necessarily agree with them on everything. Someone that they would mock and make fun of, that's been incredibly successful, that's made millions of dollars in real estate, someone that has incredible potential, someone that has demonstrated their success, come to me and say, let's talk about real solutions. Let's go meet actual people that have their own ideas. Let's invest towards this. Let's do something about it. And I stop and I look at that and I say, now what do I want to be a part of? What do I want to invest my time and energy in? I'm not going to invest my time and energy in a movement that is self-destructive, that hates me on the basis of my disagreements with them. when you realize that you possess your own worth and your own ambition, and you find other people that likewise possess a similar ambition, you don't have to agree with them upon every single ideological talking point. You think, my God, let's go do something about it. Let's go actually do something productive that can shift the course of political discourse. So that to me just kind of solidified the state of the modern right wing. It just showed me, I know that I want to do something productive. I want to do something that matters because we are at such a pivotal point in American history. And I see that this isn't working. But I also want to say, this is not an attack upon any particular individual. This is me saying, hey, this ideological approach is not working. We're not growing. We're not expanding. We're not doing anything helpful or applicable. We're not changing the world. We're not even changing one person's mind. We're not doing anything. We're, I'm sorry to interrupt you.
No, I'm listening. You're not interrupting anything. I'm just eating.
To wrap all that up, I was just thinking, I see people that I admire, that I respect, that adhere to, the alt-right. And I think, my God, why? You have potential, you have intelligence, you have ambition, you have the capacity to do something productive. Why in the name of God are you sitting around the internet shitposting all day when you can go out and you can meet people and you can do something that matters? And that's why I just don't feel any association with it. And again, that's not an attack upon anyone, but that's me saying, this ideological approach is not working. We're effectively paralyzed. We're not doing anything. And I'm ready to grow and expand my own perspectives. I'm ready to expand upon my own ambitions and go and do something. And, that's essentially how I feel about it. It's just, we've reached that point where we have to do something different.
2 questions, maybe 3. What do you want to do is the first one. I mean, I keep this poster of Ruth Bader Ginsburg behind me, thinking about you becoming the next Ruth Bader Ginsburg for the right wing. It may seem very incongruous for a conservative to have Ruth Bader Ginsburg, but I just want your picture in face of hers. You're a hell of a lot more attractive. And so I mean, what do you want to do? And I mean, I guess I'll throw in a few things. One thing that I keep thinking is how we could move debate in the real world. And one of the ways I think we can and should is by emphasizing the failure of civil rights, the failure of integration to do anything for the supposed beneficiaries, namely Black people.
Absolutely. I 100% agree. And that tactic is precisely why Candace Owens has been so successful. People in the far right often make fun of Candace Owens and insult her. She, an African-American woman, got up before Congress and openly said, I do not fear white nationalism because white nationalism is not a threat to this country. A Black woman stated that for the whole country to hear. A Black woman that is openly telling the American people, namely minorities, you're not oppressed. This is a lie that is being perpetuated in order to keep you in a state of inferiority and poverty by the federal government so that they can use you as political pawns. She is one of the most powerful political figures we have now. She's also one of the most intelligent. And that tactic is precisely what has made her so successful. People are launching what they now refer to as Blexit, which is basically the endeavor to create an awareness among minorities and say you don't have to adhere to these policies because your demographic does not define your vote. And I respect her for that. I don't need someone to simply be European to respect them. I can respect someone irrespective of these other characteristics if they're doing something productive. And for that reason, I really admire her because she has been so successful in all of those endeavors. I mean, I've seen, testimonies of the people that she has, talked to and changed their minds about political discourse. I've seen how she speaks in universities. I've seen how many people, namely college students that are minorities, say, you know what, maybe you're onto something. This is a good point that you've brought up. You're right. I have been treated as an inferior by the Democratic Party that attempts to sell me as their own political pawn to maintain influence. It's true. And I admire that more than I will ever admire some faceless troll on the internet who views everything in life with this nihilism and doesn't do anything. They don't even leave their house every day. They don't do anything productive. There's nothing respectable about that. But there is something respectable in Candace Owens. There is something respectable in Brandon Straka, who is the leader of the walkaway movement, who has millions of people that are now following his philosophy and ideology, and he's a homosexual. Two of the most influential people that we have for the right wing right now are not white nationalists. In fact, one of them's black and one of them's gay. What does that tell you? It's just fascinating because these people are influential. They are doing something to essentially bring the conversation to the number one place it needs to be, and that's at the university. That is the culmination ground for communism to take hold of the minds of the youth. And they're actually going to these places and saying, you know what? You don't have to think this way simply because your university professors insist that you do. And I respect that, and I admire that. I think that's definitely one of the number one places to start.
Well, be specific. I mean, let me throw out a specific for you and see if you like it, and if you've got others, you can throw this one out. But I was talking. Who was I talking to last month on this show? It was a very I can't remember who it was. I was talking about my dream of entering the dialogue right now involves a reversal of one of my very steadfast positions, which was that I opposed the concept of reparations for slavery. I opposed the concept of reparations for slavery because it seemed insane to me. But I've come up with a thought that perhaps we, the heirs of the Confederate States of America, ought to consider endorsing reparations in the following way and under the following conditions: that we pay for segregation that really is autonomous, that we say that we agree with Black Lives Matter, that no black person should have to fear a white policeman. Now, how do we guarantee that happen? They never see one. That's how. They never have to see
one. Good point.
And we shouldn't have to worry about blacks who are looking at us on the streets as if we might be good targets for mugging. And how do we make sure that never happens? Somebody like me, I'm oblivious. I never notice anything anyhow. But some people feel very nervous, and I think especially women do, when black guys are looking at them on the streets. And how do we do that? Well, we restore segregation. And how do we make segregation really separate but equal? We create separate jurisdictions. The city of New Orleans, has de facto segregation, what you're talking about. It wouldn't be a big trick to split the case by precinct, by city council districts. There'd be one white district that would still be New Orleans, and then there'd be the rest of it. But give them their own police department, give them a little boost grant to start off with. And so we call, basically, we create a form of separateness that is fair, and we say that this our investment in your independence is the reparation for slavery.
I think that's quite an interesting idea, and it's one that I'm not opposed to, because, you know, it's interesting. Right before you actually said, when you first said something about reparations, before you elaborated, I was actually thinking, yeah, reparations in the form of giving them their own autonomy. I can see that. I was thinking, I wonder if that's where you were going to go with it. So it's interesting that you mentioned that, because I definitely feel that is a point that should be discussed, because what does the left constantly talk about? They talk about diversity. What is diversity? Diversity is the existence of multiple demographics that are distinct from one another. That is diversity.
Yeah,
So,
but nobody understands that. They think that shake and bake is diversity. They think that if you put everybody together, that's diverse. No,
but it's not
it erases. You know, if you put
diversity.
everything together in one soup, you can't taste anything. And if you,
Exactly.
I mean, it's insane. Real diversity. I mean, as an anthropologist, I have a PhD in anthropology, and you know, as an anthropologist, diversity comes from the isolation of small populations,
Right.
genetic and
Absolutely.
cultural. You know, there are black people who, for instance, were demanding, and this was another convergence. I forget who it is in the black community, maybe, who's saying that they want Florida. I kind of favor that. Now, and basically, the way it would work in a practical matter, the way it would work is, you know, you can't, as you said, you can't do things by a forcible deportation quickly, you know, rounding people up and putting them in boxes. That's what the feds do right now with us. And you know, it should not be part of our program. So what we do is, you know, basically we start locally and we say, okay, here's our goal. All of Florida. I have this vision of, do you know where Interstate 4 is in Florida? It goes from Daytona Beach to Tampa.
Okay, right. I've been in that area.
Okay, I have this vision. All of Florida south of Interstate 4 can basically be allocated to blacks as slavery reparations. I don't know about the whole state of Florida. Maybe it needs to be the whole state of Florida. I'm not sure. But let's start off with just South Florida. Every city then can start having basically local relocations where New Orleans could basically buy out the few blacks in the one majority white district, and buy out the few whites in the majority black districts, and have local. But then there'd be all these incentives to move people to Florida, and there'd be incentives for white people to move out of South Florida.
I mean, why not? I mean, you know, give them, you know, a space for, you know, their communities and their people and their idea. I mean, give them their autonomy. You know, I respect their right to have their autonomy and pursue their own respective interests. I've always said that. I you know, respect that for any demographic. So what's wrong with that? You know, for Europeans to have their respective autonomy, and, you know, African Americans to have their respective autonomy, and every group have their own, you know, respective interests to pursue. You have the right to do that.
I think what it really requires is an endorsement of the concept of noblesse oblige. And maybe this will be distasteful to people who want us to turn communist, but you know, I guess I'm old enough and old-fashioned enough to sort of believe that there's some kind of reality to white supremacy. Ooh, do you shudder to be in my presence? I think that we have it within us to make deals that make sense for everybody. And I mean, you know, I've had a skin cancer scare recently. You know what it comes from? It comes from living down south. You know what blacks never get? Skin cancer. At least not from the sun, they don't. And so, I mean,
One advantage.
trading South Florida would not be a bad idea for white people or for black people. And you know, can we? I mean, can I think that there's some black people who would support that. I don't know if Candace Owens. What do you? Where does she stand? I don't really know the microcosm of where she stands on these kinds of issues.
You know, she hasn't really talked about identity politics too much in terms of black identity and that sort of thing. But she does advocate this kind of interesting thing where it's basically she addresses her own demographic, right? So she stays within this interest of primarily of Blexit. That's what she calls it, of the idea of minorities taking back their own identity from the Democratic Party. So she doesn't really talk about it specifically in terms of racial context, but you know, the fact that that is obviously what she aims for, to me is interesting in itself. And that's one reason why I follow her work, is because I think it's just interesting to see how she addresses her own demographic and essentially is attempting to lead them away from.
But if you follow it, what does she say? What are her proposals? What does she want to do?
Well, the main idea is to establish a kind of independence, I think, among blacks that are separate from democratic politics. They're separate from governmental reliance on, you know, all of those types of assistance programs and affirmative action, all those things. She completely rejects those things. It is very much an insistence upon a type of independence for Black Americans, which I 100% agree with that. I think that's very admirable and respectable. And for that reason, I actually just saw a video recently of her going to university, and Antifa were literally calling her racial slurs. White people, white Antifa were literally calling her racial slurs and, you know, calling her a Nazi, which I think is hilarious, and trying to attack her. And all because she advocates a Black identity that is separate from democratic and liberal policies, which is very,
But I mean, you were talking about specifics. Does she have any specifics?
Well, like I said, she doesn't really get into, I don't think, many specifics regarding the racial issue, but it's kind of an underlying theme in her idea. So it's an underlying theme of, you know, we have an identity that is separate from what you have been told that it is, which is that it's merely something that makes you contingent upon governmental reliance and upon victimization. So her whole thing is to essentially take away the notion that blacks are inherently victimized and give them back a sense of identity and independence in their identity, which I respect. But that's the main thing that she drives home. She doesn't really, you know, delve into that too much. She doesn't exactly seem like, you know, a Black nationalist or anything, but or at least she doesn't say that. But that's kind of her approach on things from what I've seen thus far.
So what are some of your specific proposals? I mean, what would you like to see happen?
Well, I definitely agree with you about, you know, the voluntary segregation thing. And I think that it is mutually beneficial. And it's interesting because I've already seen it happen just without the financial incentive. You know, I've seen it happen in Chicago. I've seen it happen in lots of places. I mean, like you mentioned in New Orleans, and I'm sure in New York and a lot of other places, you know, this is something that we see more and more of because it is natural and spontaneous to want to be around your own demographic, and that's fine. And I'm definitely 100% in agreement with that. And I think that idea combined with the idea of essentially depriving the federal government's capacity to provide us everything that we need, you know, establishing a more of an agrarian lifestyle, one that does develop self-sufficiency, standing in opposition to the federal government's power over education. All these things go together in that they're all integral to, you know, developing an independence away from our contingency on the federal government, because the whole idea is to establish, you know, something that is sovereign in itself, something that is self-sufficient, something that is independent, something that doesn't require this overbearing federal government, because that was never the intention of the American philosophy. That was never what was supposed to happen. So, you know, if we go back to the original ideas of sovereignty and independence, of personal liberty, which is also, of course, personal responsibility, self-education, so on and so forth, those are the things that I want to see. And that is something that we see in terms of, you know, more of a confederacy, something that is comprised of these, you know, locations that are in themselves self-sufficient, that are, voluntarily segregated, things like that. All of these things are integral components of accomplishing the goal, which is for all the different demographics to establish themselves in their respective interests, and do so without having an impeding federal governmental authority over them, telling them what they can and can't do, and being essentially put in a chokehold by all the regulations that they're forced to deal with. So, all of those things go into my personal ideas of what we need to do and how we get there and everything. So it's really interesting. I'm pretty sure, when I write more on this, because I will be writing on this soon, that I'll, develop my ideas more on the topic, which I'll send that to you when I get done writing it.
Well, do you think, I mean, you're talking about education and decreasing the power of the federal government. Do you think that Trump has taken any steps in that direction?
Interestingly enough, Trump has in certain departments, like in the education department. I know Trump has made several endeavors. I know that he cut a lot of the federal involvement in education. That was one thing that I did have, props for him for, that I did respect and admire. Now, there are other areas that I'm not so sure about right now with this whole situation with the Middle East. I'm a little uneasy about that. Things like that definitely cause me to speculate about, okay, what are you doing, Trump? What direction are you going in?
I guess some people think, and I kind of wonder if it's true, do you think that Trump believes that his only chance of achieving any reform lies in placating, shall we say, the Zionist lobby?
To some extent, because look at how deeply infiltrated American politics is in terms of Judaic influence. I mean, it's not a surprise that, we know that 2% of the population controls over 99% of the media. We know that. We know that everything is perceived through the eyes of Judaic influence. And irrespective of what one wants to think about that, is the truth. And that's not bigoted or hateful in the least. It's just statistical fact. But, Trump being in the position that he is and having family that is also Jewish, it's definitely something that I think you have to acknowledge, that to some extent he's going to do that. But then again, there is no presidential candidate that wouldn't really. I don't think there's, there's not exactly a lot of candidates.
No presidential candidate for the 40, 50 years after the 67 war was willing to recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel.
Right.
So, I mean, he's shown extraordinary courage in that regard. And I mean, you're in Georgia. Are you in North or South Georgia?
I'm in West Georgia.
Southwest Georgia. So are you fairly close to the Florida border?
Yes, hour and a half away. So.
Okay. What do you think about this new legislation in Florida?
Oh, the hot topic of abortion is really interesting. Is that the one you're referring to, the abortion issue?
No, I was not.
Oh, no. Well, that's the one everybody's been talking about. I thought that's the one you were talking about. I was like, that's an interesting thing to bring up.
Well, I mean, I mean, if you want to talk about that, we could. But no, I actually wanted to know what you thought about the new definition of hate speech in Florida. Are you familiar with that issue?
I don't think I've seen a lot about that. Like I said, everything that I've seen pertaining to Georgia and Florida has been about abortion, so I don't think I've seen that one. I didn't know that. Did they redefine it?
Florida has just enacted a statute that anything disparaging about the state of Israel or Jewish people, basically anything can be construed as a hate crime, and they've integrated it. I think it's specifically focused on schools and behavior in schools. And if you haven't seen it, I'll have to send it to you. But it's passed the legislature, and I believe it's on the governor's desk, Governor Rick Scott's desk.
God have mercy.
And basically, it says, hang on, let me see if I can bring it up and read it to you, because I think I saved it here. It's let me see if I can do this. I have such a disorganized. because it's not coming up, damn it. I thought I had saved it. I probably shouldn't waste our time here looking for it, but the Semitism. Nope, I can't pull it up real fast, but basically there's legislature in the state of Florida that is passed both houses, and it's on the governor's desk, and it basically says that suppressing anti-Semitism will not constitute a violation of the First Amendment. It actually kind of says that. And
that is absurd on every conceivable level. And if that ever passes into a form of actual legislation by the governor, then I'm going to be utterly appalled, because that's not how free speech works. If this were about Islam, we would consider it to be utterly atrocious and tyrannical, and it would be considered an act of treason. Why? Because it would be an invested interest in a foreign government, and in defense of that government's interest, when we're not that country. This is a foreign country that we're talking about. We are not Israel. We are a country that is sovereign and distinct, and not should not be invested ideally in the interest of Israel. And that is a form of totalitarianism in its own sense. My God, you have a right to say whatever the hell you want to say about whatever country you want to say. You have a right to express an educated opinion on that.
Well,
what more can I say? That's atrocious. There's nothing
obviously,
I need a glass of wine after hearing about that. I don't even know how to deal with that. That's atrocious. Irrespective of your religious beliefs, which I would argue that Christians that would defend that, because they believe that the Jews are God's chosen people, should reread their scriptures, particularly where they're referred to as the synagogue of Satan, and that they are, according to Paul, contrary to all men. But that's an entirely different argument that is confined to the realm of theological debate. So I'll leave that there.
I found it online. I thought I had saved it, but I just pulled it up. This is an article from the Times of Israel. Florida Senate passes anti-Semitism bill. Times of Israel. And if you haven't read this, would you like to take a little break and look this up, and then we reconvene, and I'll try to go on Facebook this time?
Are we going to do a discussion solely dedicated to that? If so, then I'll.
Just start and take a little break and start with that. Would you like to do that?
Sure, that's fine.
Okay, I'm gonna end this meeting. Aviale, thank you very much. This is May 15th. We'll have to talk a little bit more about the calendrical significance, but I'll meet you back here in a few minutes. Okay.
Sounds good.